Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 7 of Serve Like Jesus. I'm Ben Foley, the president of Serve Now, joined by my colleagues, Emily and Kendall. So let's just dive right into it this week. We have another special guest that will be joining us a little bit later. But what is God speaking to you? Where are you at? How are you doing?
I'll go first because it's off of the top of my mind. So, what I've been kind of walking through and God's been speaking to me is from the Gospel of John, where he says that I am the vine and you are the branches, and just talking about fruit and how, think of a tree. You can't produce fruit if the branch is not connected to the tree. And so I think just reminding myself, if I'm not connected to God in that moment, fruit will not come. And fruit takes a while to develop and to grow. And I think it's just the reminder of connection comes first and then the bearing of the fruit. So even just correlating it to during my daily time, spending time with God, like not trying to rush it because of one thing or the next thing or the busyness of life, but like slowing down, even if that means my daily dedicated time is split up between the beginning of the day, the middle of the day. I don't want to ever cut it short. And so just being intentional about that. And also too, like, a branch itself does not strain itself to produce the fruit. So it's not necessarily about how much we do it, but it's about the quality and just staying connected and being in the Word and being intentional with that time. And so that's kind of what I'm walking through and just trying to keep in mind and not trying to rush my time with God.
That's good, Emily. I guess we lost Kendall there, but
Hopefully he'll come back.
he'll pop back on. But it made me think. I was actually recording a message for we have another YouTube service that goes out. It really happens through Sri Lanka, but it's put out in 3 different languages: Sinhala, Tamil, which is an Indian language, and then in English. So they are available on YouTube. If you look up Serve Now and then Unity Service, you can actually find these. But we have worship and prayer from around the world, and then I give a brief devotional message. We started this during COVID, but it became so popular, not just in Sri Lanka, but other countries, that we continued it over time. And still are doing it. But there was literally a message that I was recording this week that was dealing with exactly what you're talking about, but it's in the context of where Jesus was sending his disciples out 2 by 2. But it was to cast out demons, to heal the sick, to proclaim the kingdom of God, and he's giving all these instructions to them. But what always catches my attention in that is that before he sent his disciples out with power, it says that he first called them to himself. So they had to draw near before they were sent out. Right, the relationship comes before the fruit. The being personally with Jesus comes before going out in his name with power. Exactly what you're talking about with the vine and the branches. That's good.
I love that.
Yeah, well,
I feel like a lot of times when we're doing these podcasts, a lot of what God's walking us through interweaves at certain times. So it's cool just to see how he's working similarly in our journeys and how we get to share that with our listeners.
Yeah, and hopefully that's true for our hearers as well. For those that are tuning in, I hope some of the things that we're sharing with you also are speaking to what God's doing or saying in your lives, and hopefully that's an encouragement. By the way, we'd love to hear from you too. If you want to comment somewhere in these posts, certainly like and subscribe and share with others, or shoot us an email, even at our Serve Now general email address, servenow@weservenow.org. We'd love to hear from you. Even any questions you have, or topics or parts of the world that you might like us to address or to speak to. I was just thinking about that the other day. We'd love to get some of your feedback and hear what might be on your heart.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Well, good. I guess I'll go while we see if we can get Kendall back on this. I actually have 3 things that I'd like to share. I feel like, God's just speaking to me in a number of different areas. 2 of those have to do with messages that I'm getting ready to preach over the next 2 weeks. here coming up, next 2 Sundays coming up. This Sunday that of the week that we're recording it is going to be Pentecost Sunday, so I'm preparing a message based on Pentecost. But the thing that I have been reminded of and that has caught my eye again is the fact that from the very beginning, when the Holy Spirit came and the church really was birthed, it began globally. And what I mean by that is that while this happened very locally in Jerusalem, it actually says in Acts chapter 2 that present at that time were people from all over the world. Jewish people from all over the world were coming because there were still major festivals that were taking place. In fact, Pentecost is tied to a very major festival for the Jewish people that you can read about in the Old Testament, and there's very important imagery and pictures and intentional connection point between Pentecost and Jewish holidays, even over this whole season. But there were people from every part of the known world at that time that heard the gospel when Peter stood up to explain what was happening, because they had all gathered together when they heard the sound, which was the sound of the Holy Spirit coming. They all gathered together. Peter stood up, he preaches the gospel, and it lists all these countries, all these places, all these languages that people were coming from and hearing the gospel proclaimed in their language. And so from the very beginning, there was always a global dynamic, a global reality to what the church is. And I think there again, we've talked about this on a lot of our podcasts. We shouldn't have this either or mindset between local and global. It's a both and we're to go into all the world. But even right there at the very beginning were people from every part of the world that heard the gospel in their own language from day one, from ground zero. The second message that I'm getting ready for is going to be one on navigating disappointment. And as I've been working through that, I've been thinking about a lot of different things. The main thing being how I believe we need to allow more room in our churches, in our conversations, in our own lives and relationship with others for doubts, for disillusionment, for disappointment, for grief, and for these things to be experienced and for them to be expressed, even to be normalized. That it's not an indication of a weak faith, and it doesn't have to lead to a destruction of our faith. These things can actually strengthen our faith, and it's not a lack of faith to experience or to express these things. In fact, I would argue that it takes real faith to face head on and not ignore or deny our doubts, our disappointments, our disillusionment, that there's actually something very authentic about that on a very human level, but we don't have to also be ignoring or denying and being super spiritual about these things or trying to over spiritualize these. Scripture makes room for it and gives room for us to, again, not only experience, but also to express it. And maybe something I've seen that is new to me, we often talk about Job's friends and how, when the first week they did what was best in sitting with Job in silence, because it says they saw how great his grief was, and they didn't say anything, they just sat with him in his suffering. But then after that week period, they got restless and they started to want to provide explanations and reasons and even all kinds of theological discussions over why he was suffering and what he should do about that, basically trying to find fault with him and saying, you must have done something wrong, otherwise this wouldn't be happening to you, and they just made his suffering worse, right? We've talked about that even on some of these podcasts. But what I saw for the first time in a little different light was, and realizing even in my own life and how some things I've gone through and the way that I've experienced it, and then just thinking about others that are suffering or grief that they're experiencing, what struck me is that it's not simply that Job's friends were a comfort because they were silent or silent about his suffering. It was that they saw Job's suffering and they sat with him in it. And that's what was really comforting. What would not have been comforting would have been for them to not see him in his suffering, not sit with him in it, and just be silent about it. And what I saw is that there is a difference between sitting with someone in silence in their suffering versus being silent about somebody's suffering. Because if we're just silent about other suffering, then it comes across like it doesn't matter, and we feel very unseen. But if we sit with people in silence, with them in their suffering, they feel seen, they feel comforted, and they know that they matter and what they're going through matters as well. And I've just realized that's been very true for me. Like, people who have just said nothing and acted like everything is normal, that has stung, and stings worse than people who engage in conversation with it or about it, even if they don't know what to say. But there are other people who have sat with me in it, and they've not really said anything, but I felt seen and I felt comforted, and I felt like it matters. And I think people who are suffering, they don't want to be, they don't want that suffering to define them or become like their sole identity, but they do want to be seen in their suffering. And there is a big difference about in all of that of being silent versus being with people in their grief. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think for me too, just recognizing the flip side of it. And like, if you see people suffering, you can be an example of Jesus to them by sitting with them through their suffering, and just acknowledging what they're going through and being there for them, even if you don't understand it or you don't know what to do. I think because Jesus goes with us in our suffering. And so I think even just the simplest of ways, like, you can help be a light to them.
Yeah, in fact, there was a story. I'll let Kendall jump in here in a minute now that we got him back. But there was a story in that we received this very week where we were providing water tanks for people in a country in Asia in a community. And one comment really stood out to me in that, where this person at the end, after sharing what it meant to them, it wasn't just about the physical water and the difference that will make in their life. Their comment was how they felt seen because someone showed up, and there is just something about seeing people for where they're at and the things that they're struggling with that really does matter. But when we're silent and we ignore or we just look away, man, does that hurt, and actually is a lack of human dignity or acknowledging, the suffering of others when we want it to matter.
Yeah. So some of the things that I've been walking through recently has been related to kind of feeling like my own personal accomplishments are not as far along as I want them to be. And I was reading Psalm 33 recently, and also in Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy 32:9 says, "For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance." And also in Psalm 33, it talks about us being God's inheritance. And so often we think about um, us having God as our inheritance, but this particular passage, and even some of the parables in the New Testament, where Jesus is talking about a person going and searching for a hidden treasure, there are many people who recognize that that's actually God searching for us. Sometimes we think we're searching for God, but God actually sees us as his inheritance. And that just struck me the other day. Basically, I cannot do enough to win God's love. It's impossible. But he sought us out. He sought after us. He came to us. And I think it does connect a little bit to what you were saying there, Ben, of people coming to us in our pain, God is the ultimate example of that. We as humans will always fall short in trying to enter properly or helpfully into another person's pain. But God, while we were still sinners, died for us. God, who set aside the glories of heaven, came to earth, and he came to us. He saw us as his inheritance, a treasure that he wanted to pursue, which really struck me this week in a profound way, at a time that I needed that reminder. So
that's great. I think that's it's a good reminder, even as representatives of Christ, as ambassadors of his, to carry that same heart simply in just seeing people and then taking action in some way that would restore a level of human dignity and convey the reality of God's love for them. It is more profound than we realize, which is why we often come back to saying projects that we're engaged in around the world are more than just projects. They really are a way to show God's love in action so that people feel seen and they can come to really experience and encounter his love for them. So yeah, thank you guys all for sharing. Okay, well, our special guest has actually just arrived. I'll introduce her here in a little bit, but before we get to her, Kendall, Emily, was there a story from around the world that particularly stood out to you recently?
Yeah, so I think for me, the story that stood out was an African country that received a grant from ServeNow to help flood victims. So the whole community came together, and actually the Ministry of Public Health, I think, is what actually got activated and came alongside this community. So originally it was to raise support for flood victims, but they also came alongside them to provide awareness and medical treatment for malaria. So they came together in so many ways and provided medical care, and it actually spanned over a couple weeks, I think, and there were over 300 people that ended up testing positive, so they received this care. And during this whole initiative, they distributed the basic series books to these people, and the spiritual impact from all of this was great. I think 45 people gave their life to Christ and started attending church regularly, and then 38 are following up with people from the event about going to church and getting involved and asking questions. And I think what really stood out to me was that there was a core group of people there that dedicated their lives to Christ that struggled with alcoholism. And 25 people in a community like that is pretty significant. And I think the words that came through the story were that group was disbanded. So hopefully it will help that trend continue of people not participating in alcoholism, and it really will help their community understand how these people were once living in sin and broken, and now they're walking with the Lord. And so I think that's kind of been, since I saw that story, I've just been praying, because I've known some people, family history and all kinds of things, that struggled with alcoholism. And so that was just something that stood out and has been a specific prayer of mine over the past few days.
Yeah, Emily, you actually stole mine, because that
No!
also stood out to me, and I think it's just a great example of the holistic nature of ServeNow. That sometimes we think of these projects isolated, or we only think of one part of it, like this was providing food aid for flood victims, but was more than that. It also involved medical care, treating those with malaria. It also involved some soccer games and events, tournament for some of the youth there while all this was happening. And then we gave out 2,000 copies of the Basic Series book about Jesus. And then, like Emily said, this led to salvations. It led to rededications. It led to people finding deliverance from, in this case, quite a number struggling with alcohol. So a beautiful example of the whole, how these seemingly isolated projects really are more holistic, and people are being served on multiple levels.
And I think, too, just in addition, it wasn't just that community that came. There were other communities from other parts of Africa that came to be involved in this, too. So I thought that was really cool.
Awesome. How about you, Kendall?
Yeah, so what stood out to me, Ben, you had talked earlier about some of the water projects that happen in Asia, and there was a particular um, story that just there was a woman, a mother, whose comment when a water tank was brought to her village, she said, every day water was always in my mind. Before cooking, before caring for my children, before anything else, we had to think about water. Sometimes we walked again and again. Now, for the first time, I feel some peace. It may just seem like a tank, but for us, it changes daily life. And that really stood out to me this week because I've had my own challenges. We had some car transportation issues in the area I work in, the area I live in. We don't have like public transportation. So if you don't have a car, you're not going anywhere. And so what's been on my what's been on my mind all week has been transportation automobile, because one car was in an accident, one car wasn't working, we were down to like one car for 4 people in my household. So anyway, it really struck me that, as much as transportation was on my mind this week and thinking and challenging, and something that we take for granted here in the US, the simple gift of clean water, is the thing that many people around the world struggle with, which is so much more basic than even something as simple as transportation. So that's the story that really struck me this week, and reminded me to pray for folks around the world that really don't have access to even something as simple as clean water.
Well, Kendall, I guess you and I were experiencing some similar problems there, because my oldest daughter got in her first accident, and insurance labeled it as a total loss. Nobody was hurt, thankfully, by the way, but the car is like majorly damaged, and damaged beyond what we thought it was going to be and what it would cost to fix. So kind of dealing with some similar dynamics there too. By the way, before we transition to our special guest, I did want to talk about some updates related to our last episode with our last special guest. We had Arjun from a country in Asia, and we talked about one of our children's centers that had been the whole community where that was in a dangerous location and government controlled property. They did come in and level all of that, so our center there was gone, but we did secure a new place, and actually a bigger place and a more secure place. So we have just signed the lease on that. It is going to increase our monthly costs significantly, but it will accommodate more children. And so now the next step is getting some of the new furniture that will be needed for this particular location. But about 70 of the kids that were impacted by their community being destroyed will be able to participate in this new center, and we'll be able to accommodate even more kids beyond that. Some of the other kids have actually been relocated to other areas where we have other children's centers. So that's been one thing we're grateful for, at least in the midst of a really devastating situation. But yeah, for those that are listening, if you could continue to pray for that, and we do need some new partners to help with the increased costs, and that this new center is putting us in a position of needing. But it should turn out to be a wonderful new place for even more kids than before, and just continue to pray for those families as we're trying to provide immediate relief with food aid and mosquito nets, and malaria is a big thing this time of the year, and just some other needs as they go through this process of being uprooted yet again. So a very tough situation. Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and get around to our special guest for this episode. And this is probably, as you can see, if you're watching this, the name on her screen, Jojo. She is from Uganda. And the reason this is a very special guest for us to have is because ServeNow's first project was in her country. And it's a project that she actually was a direct recipient of in terms of work that would happen in Uganda at that time when ServeNow got started. But now Jojo actually is on our staff, and so this has kind of come full circle in that she was once in a vulnerable position, but now is a voice for other vulnerable people. But as a direct recipient of ServeNow, she's now also to represent many others that we're seeking to serve all over the world. So that's a very special, unique thing about JoJo. And JoJo and I have known each other for a long time. She used to even help with some of the teams that we would bring to Uganda when she was still living there. She was part of the first choir from Uganda, kids choir, that came over to the United States and actually sang at one of our banquets. And we still have some of those kids come across the U.S. and sing at different places. They've been at my church. They've been at other churches around. But JoJo was a part of that very first group. So there's a long history here, but she's now been officially working with ServeNow for the past 3 years. So with that introduction, JoJo, why don't you share a little bit more about yourself, your upbringing, and kind of your role now, and how you've come into this point and place in your life that has positioned you to be a voice for others.
Yes, I'm so glad to be here today, and thank you for having me as a guest. It's a joy and a privilege. Well, as we've all had, I am originally from Uganda, the best country in the entire world. Sorry for those that might offend, but it's I have to brag about my country. But Uganda is such a beautiful country to me, the eastern part of Africa, and um, I am Ugandan. I am a Muganda. I speak Luganda, so it's all the Ganda, all the Ganda things. But grew up from Uganda in a very small community, and my childhood has a lot in it. Growing up, it was tough. It was hard. Um, it's a long story that I always call it's a God story to the fact that I'm even here today. I never expected to be here today, especially here in the United States, and even be able to work for Serve now. But it's definitely been a journey that only God has focused, that God has led every step of the way. And I'm so grateful. I'm so thankful. And maybe I'll tell you a little bit about my childhood. Um, Growing up as a little girl in Uganda, I have two amazing sisters and a brother in Uganda. But growing up, when I was about 4 years old, I had my mom, I had my dad, and we were a happy family. We were glad we had each other, and my mom was that strong, uh, that strong person in our home that almost held everything together. And we looked at her; she was the one holding everything together in our home. And before my youngest sister Sarah was born, I remember my mom was pregnant with her, and she had to have a C-section. And there was just a small nearest clinic that we had that didn't have the best of the quality doctors or nurses that were qualified. And my dad takes hard there to to give birth, to have a C-section. The doctors do what they did. I mean, and even when I talk about a clinic, what I mean is was just a very small building that only had, at that point, it only had maybe a few medications in there, some of them which might be even expired. And so that's the place that my mom was taken to give birth. They went ahead and did the C-section, but then they sent her back home. We were happy that our sister was born and she was in good health. But then all of a sudden, my mom just starts developing complications, and she's in deep pain every single day. Now I'm 4 years. I can barely understand it. I can barely understand what is going on. But I'm looking at somebody that I was looking up to, who was holding the family together, and she can't do that anymore because she's in this deep pain, and every day she couldn't even get up. So my dad decides to take her back to the clinic. And when I speak about my dad, this was also a person who was struggling to make ends meet for our family. He didn't have a stable job. He was trying to do manual work here and there, trying to provide his family, because I remember some days were days where you didn't know where even your next meal is going to come from. So each day was a day of survival. And here is the mother who's in the pain, taken back to the same clinic where she had had the C-section. And on going there, they tell my dad that they didn't do a good job, that when they were doing the surgery, they left something within her womb, and this is what was causing the pain. And on top of that, they told him that in order for us to even carry out the surgery, we need about $50. Now, when I say $50, that sounded like $1 million to my dad, because we didn't know anybody even in our community that could help us get that money. And the doctors just told him to take my mother back because they couldn't do anything and they needed the money. And without the money, they couldn't even touch her. And in that reality, she was sent home. And even when I say home, we lived in a bamboo house made out of bamboo and sticks, and like we kids laid on the floor without any padding, without any beds or mattresses, made out of grass that you didn't know when it rained, or if the weather was bad, that you'd even wake up the next day having a roof over your head, surviving on one meal a day. So my childhood was a rough journey, because as I said, each day was a day of survival. We're not even being able, as kids, we couldn't even afford to go to school, because education in Uganda, you have to pay for it from kindergarten, and it's very expensive. And at some point, some parents don't even see the value of education because they themselves never had the opportunity to go to school. And that was my childhood. On top of that, walking miles and miles every single day to even go and get clean water, because there was not even access to clean water, because the water you had was merely a swamp that is shared with the animals, and that's the water that we had. And drinking that, we could just get sick. And so childhood was filled with loneliness and hunger and uncertainty and being hopeless, asking, will our lives ever matter? Will our lives ever um, make sense? Because one night I remember my mom, as she laid in the house, my dad was not at home. And she cried out in my language, calling out because she needed help and she needed to get out of the house. My brother and I were waking up in the middle of the night. It's dark because we didn't even have electricity. My dad is not at home. So me and my brother go to where my mom is, and we tried to lift her up because she couldn't even lift herself up. And we walked with her, trembling because she's more stronger than us. But my brother and I, 4 years old and 6 years old, get out of the house and we walk in the dark at night with my sick mother, trying to go and find help. And I remember us just walking that night and walking, but we couldn't find any help. And slowly we decided to just return back home because there was nothing that we could find. And the next day we watched her die. And as a child, you can't put everything all together, but you just know that somebody you cared for is not there anymore and that she's not going to be back. And in that season of grief, I remember myself because I was the oldest. I had to grow up really fast and take care of the baby that was just born and take care of my siblings. And it was hard. It was hard. It was um, challenging because I don't think that I knew God that much at that point of my life, but I remember just praying to somebody that why us? Would somebody ever care? Would somebody ever come to help us? Because in that period, my dad decided that we needed somebody to play a role of a mother in our lives, and he decided to find another woman who became our stepmother. And at some point, we're like, oh, we're excited. We get somebody to be a mother in our lives. But apparently, she made it clear that we were never her priority and we didn't matter. And she abused us mentally, physically, emotionally because we were never her own. And that's where you ask yourself so many questions about life and wonder. And you just don't know what to do. You just don't know what to do as a child. You just have no way out. And at some point, I remember because in Uganda, so many children, if they don't have parents or they're not even able to go to school, you would find kids as young as 10, 13, 12 going to streets to beg and to do drugs, or girls as young as 13 going into prostitution because this is the only way they know how to survive. And without education for children in Uganda, life just becomes a battlefield, and so many kids getting orphaned at a very young age before even they know what the word orphan means. And that was us, that was me, a girl who at a very early age felt like I'd lost everything. I was invisible, nobody cared, nobody, was concerned even about us. And then I love to say that somehow God made a way in different ways that I don't even know, because in the community that we lived in, there was uh, a man and a wife, Pastor Moses and Hopkins, who had just started this very small school in Uganda and a church. And that the call was to rescue orphan and vulnerable children, to give them a safe home, to give them education, and to create opportunities for them to have a better future. And so they just heard about our story in the community we're living in, and how we were being mistreated and how we're being abused by our stepmother and barely surviving on a meal a day. And I remember they invited us to go to this school, a small school they had just started, and we shared our story. They learned about what we're going through, and they decided that they want to help, that they want to help us in whatever way that they can. And I remember that day was a day that seemed like a bright light was just turned on out, being coming down from a very dark pit. And they were strangers. We barely knew nothing about them. They were strangers that we didn't have any connection or any relationship to. But they chose to love us with the love of Christ. They opened up their house, their home, their resources. And they didn't even have that much, but they chose to welcome us in and loved on us and showed us that there is a way and that God cares and that we can depend on them. And this is the coordinators of Serve Now in Uganda, Pastor Moses and Madam Hopkins. They are the coordinators of Serve Now in Uganda. But I grew up in their household with my siblings, and on top of that, they rescued more other kids. So I grew up in a household of 20 orphaned kids, and we started going to the small school. And as Ben shared, that school that I was attending, that's where SAP now began, where one of the toilets there had just collapsed because it was made out of bamboo and mud, and the weather was horrible. So it collapsed, and thank God no one was there, no child was there. But SAP now comes in and then builds a permanent structure for the school that I was attending, building the toilet. So I know there is a book that Ben and Les have written that hope began with a toilet, and that began on the grounds of Uganda. That's where Serve Now begins, and it's unbelievable. It's a miracle in itself because I was there, being young and seeing my adopted parents believing and having faith and trusting God, and I was able to go to school with all the kids that we were with in the orphanage and traveled here in the United States as a singing group. Because what do you do with 20 kids in a home? So we started doing music and singing. So we traveled here in the United States and we would travel all around singing, performing, and doing all sorts of performances, but that was also with us to fundraise for our own education and our own basic needs when we went back to Uganda. So we would spend an entire year. That's a whole story in itself of the whole exposure coming here in the United States for the first time and so many things, so many new things. But that was also a place where we found hope, a place that we got people who barely knew us, who were strangers that would choose to come and support us. So would go back to Uganda, go to school. So I was able to go to school, go to elementary school, high school, went to college, and I did my bachelor's degree in fashion design and marketing because one of the things that I've always loved to do is to start a trade school in Uganda because growing up, I saw mainly the women and girls who are not given priority to education because there is culture stigma and so many into culture that a woman or a girl was not given priority. So seeing that myself, even having gotten through education and seeing how powerful that is, seeing how transformative that is, I had that dream from a very young age to build a trade school in Uganda and miraculously ServeNow came on board with that and that dream. I shared that with ServeNow and then of course and he picked up the dream and I was excited about it and it is still something that is a miracle because I don't know if I want to go into this right now, but I can transition into that later. But I just wanted to give you a little bit about my background, and it's a whole story, and I don't think we have enough time to share every single bit of it. But coming from Uganda, getting an education, and right now being able to also be able to do something for my country and be a voice and be an advocate and even working for Serve Now as their Pacific Northwest Department representative. So it's a whole miracle. It's a whole God story in itself.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that, Jojo. It's a really difficult, upbringing in terms of what you went through and just the tragedy of that, the grief of that, the struggle of all of that. And yet to see what God has done when everything seemed hopeless and that, there was no future, it's exactly the point where he stepped in and did provide a hope and a future. And you're a living testimony, a living example of that. And there's so much we could talk about that. But one of the key things you mentioned revolves around education in Uganda. And of course, you just touched on the fact that we are right now undertaking the single biggest project we've ever taken on as an organization, which is this trade school that you mentioned. And the reason it's a big project is because it's going to be a $3.2 million endeavor, but we felt like we could move forward on this because we do have about half of that at this point committed, particularly because two couples collectively are giving $1 million towards it. So we felt like we could get started with it. But this is going to be a 10 trade, 4-story facility that will accommodate about 400, 500 students at a time that will be able to learn these 10 different trades, whichever one of those trades that they would like to pursue. But even prior to this project, we've helped rebuild over 14 school buildings in Uganda. We've also constructed a boys' home and a girls' home just in the last couple of years, and at a couple of the other school locations where we've helped to rebuild schools. And among all of those 8 different school locations where we've built these 14 school buildings, this is providing an education for over 5,000 children. And at one time, you were one of those youth that benefited from one of these schools. Tell us, though, why education, and we're helping to support these kids. We do a lot of other projects. We don't even have time to get into all of that. But tell us why education, whether it's the school buildings that we've built and kids being able to go to school, why that's so important, and the trade school, why is that meeting such a critical need, particularly or specifically in Uganda?
Yes. So I would say that education is not just a privilege for the children from Uganda or even for the African child. It's not just a privilege. It is hope, and it's one of the greatest gifts that can break the chains of poverty, trauma, and despair. And yes, for many millions of children that don't even have that chance to even have that education. But education is where, in Uganda, for example, where I come from, it's when you begin to understand that, okay, there is an opportunity here that I have. And this is the opportunity for me to learn. Because even speaking English, we learn English when we attend school. So communication, if I don't go to school, I don't get to learn English. My biological parents don't speak English because they never had the opportunity to go to school. And so education is important in Uganda, and sometimes I love to compare it to here in the United States, because here in the United States, I there's so many opportunities. I can go work in a restaurant even if I don't have a bachelor's degree. But in Uganda, to even have that kind of opportunity, you need to have a bachelor's degree. And the challenge is because some parents also don't see, they've not seen the value of education, or they themselves have not been able to get education. They don't see it as priority why they should educate their children. And I also want to give an example of a girl child, because in Uganda, in culture wise, when a girl is born, they only see that you're only gonna be good for marriage, and we're just gonna get dowry, and we can marry you off, and that's it. But yet there is more. There is more to that. Like if a child is educated, whether that is a boy or what that is a girl, it changes their lives. It transforms their life. It gives them an exposure to a different world, ways of thinking, ways of speaking, ways of even development or growth within the community itself. So education is a pathway to a better future, to learning, to being more creative, to even integrating in different aspects of life. But if a child is not given that education, they're only limited to so much that they can do. I mean, so even in like going through elementary school, high school, and going to college. In fact, I would say that even me being having the opportunity to even going to like college or university, that is a whole miracle in itself, because so many children don't even have or can't afford even going to high school, given so college or even university. You may find that only a few make it that far. And yet it's one of the things I see it as a gift to a child, because it changes them, it transforms their lives, it opens them up to so many opportunities, and it changes their mindset from having that poverty mindset to a mindset of possibilities, to a mindset of being better, to a mindset of creating better futures, but also even contributing economically to the society or to the community. So education is very, very important, and especially to the African child.
Yeah, it's funny. So many things you talk about, even just with your own story, whether it's lack of medical access or lack of, ability to uh, afford an education. Because in Uganda, another important point is that it's not free. There is a tuition at every level that has to be paid. So, like you said, if it's a matter between education or feeding your family, of course, you're going to prioritize feeding your family over an education. But if you don't have an education, it's also nearly impossible to get to find employment, to really be lifted out of poverty. But education really is that ticket out of poverty, and it means so much more than what I think we take it for granted for here in the U.S., meaning that there can be such a disconnect for us between, we don't even think about lack of medical care or lack of education, or at least for me, my kids have been a little better than this than I was, but like I complained about school my entire process, never thinking about the reality of this and what it really means for so many children around the world that don't have access to it, or what it means when they do have access to it. And I think that's just hard for us to make those connections. But Kendall, you've been with me in Uganda, and you've been to a number of these school locations as well. Uh, what stood out to you when you traveled and saw some of the circumstances and conditions and what it really means, and even just our work in Uganda in general, for so many people and especially children in Uganda?
So I had wanted to go to Africa for probably ever since I was 18, because that's when I started sponsoring a child um, in Africa. And I thought, there's no way I can afford to go over there. I don't know if this is ever going to happen. And it wasn't until I was over 45 years old that I ended up going for the first time. Um, and my experience in being there was that I had read and saw pictures about poverty. I had heard stories, but when you're within a country or within a continent like Africa, you see that it's not just one, it's everywhere. At least that's what stood out to me, was the need was so broad, and the reality wasn't just this little pocket. Like sometimes when we think about poverty in the United States, we're just thinking about little pockets that are in various places. And here it was just everywhere we went. I mean, we drove from one school location to another school location to another school location to another school location. And everywhere we went, there were people that were living in extreme poverty. And it just struck me the magnitude of the challenges. And sometimes when we're interacting with people who are asking about partnering with ServeNow and getting involved, and they're like, well, there's so many different organizations that are working, in Africa or Asia or wherever. And I have to remind them, we're not stepping on each other's toes. The needs are so large, and the opportunity so great that we all need to be working together to really bring about that transformation. And as we think about Jojo's story, I mean, just something as simple as $50 can transform somebody's life and maybe even save somebody's life.
Yeah, Kendall, you brought up a
Yeah,
really important point there. Sorry, Jojo, I'll get back to you here in a minute. Just about this idea, I have people ask me all the time, what makes ServeNow unique, or, well, isn't we've heard this a lot, isn't compassion, for example, another big organization focuses on child sponsorship in Uganda, and I just kind of laugh because there is not only not we're not overstepping or competing with each other. I would make the case there's a need for more organizations, not less, because the need really is that great. It's beyond our comprehension, I think, until you really see it, for yourself. And we're just talking about, one country here. So, Kendall, that's, I think, a very important point. Jojo, you were going to say something?
yeah, I was going to add to what Kendall had mentioned about seeing poverty, like a lot of poverty in Uganda. And to some of that, I would say that it's not even the poverty of resources, it's the poverty of the mindset. So that is why education is important, because it changes the mindset. Because Africa is a continent full of so many resources, full of so much. But if we give the people education, we open up that pathway for them to change their mindset and be more creative, and it changes lives, it transforms them. So that's why education is important. And that's why I say like the trade school is one of those tools that is going to play a big piece into that, because the resources might be better, but we need the mindset of people. How can they make better use of the resources that are available and turn that into changing their lives and breaking those cycles of poverty that are in the country?
I think just touching on scripture, from when Kendall was talking. Like, there are multiple cases in the Bible, in Luke chapter 10 and Matthew, I think chapter 9, where it talks about the harvest is plenty, but the workers are few. And like many times in scripture back then, in the time of Jesus, he was telling people to go out into the world for the harvest. And I think it's just crazy to see too, like that is still the case today. There's so many people that need to be reached and helped, and it just is mind-blowing, I think, to even fathom how many people don't have access to Bibles or scripture, or even the basics, going back to water and food and school. So I think maybe too, I have a question for Jojo. How does having access to school help these kids along their spiritual journey in Uganda?
Hmm. So most of the schools in Uganda, like ServeNow, is part of the mainly Christian schools. So kids going to school, it creates community. Plus, like they have community, they have other kids around them. Like I can, for my own example, when I had just joined the home, the orphanage that I grew up in, all the kids that I grew up in, like 20 of us, became more like family. Like up to this day, we still see each other as brothers and sisters. And we all sang together, we went to church together, we went to school together, we did life together. It makes you feel like you're not alone, even though you may all come from different backgrounds. You feel a sense of belonging, you feel a sense of being accepted, being loved, and not that I'm not the only one going through this, but I have other people that I can do life with. So for the child, children need community, children need each other. So when they come to school, they are nurtured. That is spiritually. Because I remember the school I went to, actually, we would always, in my elementary school, every early morning we would gather and sing praise songs and dance in the morning and worship and pray. Like that's one of the things we did every single morning. And I hear so many people say, when you come together, kids are so happy even though they don't have much, because that is one of the things that you have that brings you joy, that brings you like it takes your mind off of whatever the problem was or what you had faced, and puts you into this like knowing, well, I can still smile because I have people around me that care, people that at least I am not alone in this. And having education, learning so many different things together, and I think we all want to feel like we belong somewhere. We all want to feel accepted. We all want to feel loved. So that's one of the things that it creates for children.
Yeah, and we've got this question a lot too, whether it's with a trade school or building a school, what about the spiritual component? And this is just integrated and entwined in a way that here again, it's not often the case in the U.S. because you're either go to a public school or you go to a Christian private school, right? And those are like two totally separate worlds, but that's very different in a country like Uganda. And we haven't even touched on, I know we're running close to the end of our time here and with some of our schedules, but we haven't even touched on the basic series books, for example, in Uganda, which, by the way, it is because of the impact of the basic series books in Uganda that the impact was so off the charts that we had this sense very early on in our history that it would probably be a similar case and a similar need across the rest of Africa. And so now, fast forward more than a decade later, and at least a third of the countries that we're in are African countries, and it really primarily the basic series books driving so much growth and so much life transformation and impact across the entire continent. But it really did begin in Uganda. And even right now, Moses, who, again, Jojo grew up in his home, he and his wife, who are our leaders, our directors in Uganda, he's out in some of the hardest, roughest places, literally as we're speaking, bringing basic series books, but also we just got a container of a couple thousand Bibles that are being distributed right now as we speak. And because of a gift from a church, he's also been giving out 200 more bicycles for pastors and leaders that have no other means of transportation. So there are so many things happening, and again, these things aren't really isolated from each other. They all work together. One of my favorite stories in Uganda, though, is when the Basic Series books, actually, there was a principal of a Muslim school that got a hold of our Basic Series books, and he started using them in this school with his students, and it was like a majority of the kids and the teachers started coming to faith in Jesus because of our Basic Series books being used in a Muslim school, to the point that there was such a significant movement there that the local imam, the Muslim leader of that town, got upset about that, and he ended up burning the school bus. And there were threats and all of that, so there was some safety issues. But that principal, along with a lot of the families, the children, and some of the other teachers, went off and started their own Christian school because of our Basic Series books, even reaching into a Muslim community within another part of Uganda. So there's just some powerful stories of life transformation and church growth, and as we're serving in holistic ways. But often it does take these things like education. It is so critical. We can't forget that part of it and component of it to really help people think differently and to experience a different kind of future and hope as they're being pointed to Christ along the way. Well, as we come to the end, Jojo, is there anything else you'd like to share with us, or Kendall, Emily, anything to add to this particular conversation?
Well, I'm excited about the trade school in Uganda. So that's one of the exciting things, because I think I've had that dream ever since I was young, and right now seeing that the ground has been broken and it's being built, it's all exciting, and more exciting to see the impact that it's going to bring in the community for young people, as we know that right now the job industry is changing, technology and AI. I think the next trend is going to be trades, and trades are very important, because there are certain jobs that AI will not be able to, to take over. So I'm excited about the trades, and also creating more opportunities for the young generation, for the young people to see that their lives can be transformed and changed, but also impact the community and maybe the country at large. So I'm so excited and thankful for Serve Now for being a key player in this.
Yeah, and as soon as this call is over, I haven't even yet shared with our team yet updates I got literally today of the foundation being finished. There's some new videos, new pictures of the trade school progress there, so we're going to be starting now on the upper process. But the foundation obviously being the most important part. But it's exciting to see that project that literally not only has been a dream for so long, but always felt unattainable and impossible. The fact that it's happening, and this has been true for so many dreams through the years with Serve Now, where we had no idea where the funding would come from, how we would, we have the ability to pull off a lot of these things because of the relationships, the connections, the partnerships, the leaders that we have in these countries, but it's really from a funding perspective. But to see God provide and making these dreams a reality through probably many of you that are listening to this is incredibly exciting, and we want to invite more of you into that very reality as well through Serve Now. Emily, Kendall, any final words?
Well, it's always a blessing to hear Jojo's story. It gets me every time to hear how God brought about, I guess, laid it on the hearts of folks who didn't need to bring more people into their family, but chose to. And so when we go about and share with folks like those of you who are listening, we share at churches, we share with individuals. Really, nobody has to give, nobody has to partner with us. Just like that couple in Uganda didn't have to bring more children into their home. But when they chose to, the blessing that was to Jojo, to the rest of her siblings, and the blessing that it is to folks around the world when we open our hearts and open our homes to entering into the pain of someone else and seeking to share what we have. That's ultimately showing the love of Jesus like he did for us. He didn't have to come here, didn't have to die for us, but he chose to, and what a difference his sacrifice made.
Yeah, I think for me too, just hearing Jojo's story and knowing her and what God has walked her through, it truly is a God story. And if this is one person, how many other people is this happening to? I mean, I know even Ben and me and Kendall, like God has walked us through things to get to this point to be able to serve him in the capacities we are. And so I think just praying for opportunities to arise to obey God and step out into that serving mentality, I think is something that I just want to encourage people to, because you never know how God's going to weave your story together, even when you're walking through hard times. So.
Yeah, Jojo is living proof for those watching or living. I hope, obviously, you're living if you're watching this or listening, but Jojo is living proof of just one example among many. I mean, even just our last fiscal year, as I mentioned, we served over 1 million people, right? Jojo would have been one of those. Who knows where these 1 million people even this year will wind up 10 years later, but Jojo's living proof of that. And so if there's any questions about credibility or authenticity of Serve Now and the things that we see God doing and that we get the privilege of being a part of, Jojo is a living example of that and a beautiful testimony of God bringing someone so full circle from one who, again, was once vulnerable to now being a powerful voice for others that are vulnerable. So thank you all for listening. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for joining this 7th episode. There's more to come, and more guests that we want to introduce you to and expose you to their stories and what they see God doing around the world. But thank you, Jojo, for joining as our special guest this time. Of course, being from Uganda, and Uganda being the first country, we have to say that Uganda is the first and Uganda is the favorite. And so, Jojo, thank you for representing Uganda.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a joy and a pleasure, and happy to be part of this amazing team as well. So thank you.
Amen. All right. Until next time, take care. God bless you.